On the 28th of February 1931, the German government issued a set of medical regulations. At the time, they were among the most advanced in the world. They stated that no human being could be experimented upon without unambiguous consent given only after being told what would be done to them and what it might cost them. They forbade research that exploited the poor and the desperate. They placed special protections around children. That document was never repealed. It was still binding law in 1942 when a man was sealed inside a steel chamber at Dachau and the air was slowly drawn out of it, while a physician sat on the other side of the glass with a stopwatch, recording the moment he lost consciousness and then recording what happened after that. The doctor knew the law existed. Years later, some of the men who stood trial for these experiments would specifically ask to be judged by it. So this is not the story of a country that had no rules. It is the story of what happened when the rules stayed exactly where they were, printed, filed, legally valid, sitting in an office drawer, and the men trained to follow them decided that the person strapped to the table was not the kind of person the rules had been written for. That decision is what this film is about. Not the instruments, not the injuries, the decision. Why doctors? Not soldiers, not guards, not men recruited from prisons and given uniforms. Doctors. People who had spent 6, 8, 10 years learning how a body works in order to keep it working. Historians who have studied the German medical profession under Nazism have found something that resists easy explanation. Doctors joined the Nazi Party at a higher rate than any other profession in Germany. The most widely cited estimates put the figure at roughly 45%. An extraordinary number for a group that thinks of itself as apolitical, evidence-driven, and bound by an oath. They were not dragged in. Many of them walked. To understand why, you have to understand that something had already changed in medicine before the camps existed, and it did not begin in Germany. In the first decades of the 20th century, an idea spread through the scientific establishments of Europe and North America. It was called eugenics. Its premise was that human populations could be improved the way livestock is improved, by encouraging reproduction among the desirable and preventing it among the rest. It was not fringe. It was taught in universities. It was funded by respectable foundations. Laws permitting compulsory sterilization passed in several countries, including the United States, years before Hitler came to power. What Nazi Germany did was take that idea and remove every restraint from it. In July 1933, 6 months after Hitler became chancellor, the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases was passed. It authorized compulsory sterilization of people diagnosed with a list of conditions, some genuinely heritable, some not, some barely medical at all. Hereditary health courts were established. Physicians sat on them. Physicians reported the names. Estimates of the number of people sterilized under this law run to roughly 400,000. Notice what has already happened here. A doctor is no longer working for the patient in front of him. He is working for something called the health of the nation, an abstraction that has no body, no pain, and no opinion about the procedure. The patient has become a variable. 6 years later, that logic reached its conclusion. In 1939, the regime authorized what it called euthanasia, the systematic killing of institutionalized people with disabilities and mental illness. It was run out of an office at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, which is why historians call it Action T4. Killing centers were established at Grafeneck, Brandenburg, Hartheim, Sonnenstein, Bernburg, and Hadamar. Victims were transported in buses with painted-over windows. They were murdered in sealed rooms using carbon monoxide gas. Internal statistics captured after the war recorded 70,273 people killed in the first phase alone by August 1941. Doctors selected them. Doctors signed the forms. Doctors were present in the rooms. And here is the detail that matters most. The men who designed the gas chambers of T4, who tested the method, who learned the logistics of killing large numbers of people indoors, some of them were transferred east. The technique did not stay in the hospitals. By the time the first prisoner was strapped into a low-pressure chamber at Dachau, German medicine had already spent 9 years being taught a single lesson, repeated in law, in funding decisions, in professional advancement. Some human beings are material. The experiments did not corrupt German medicine. They were what German medicine had already become.
In 1941, the German Air Force had a problem it could not solve on paper. Aircraft were flying higher. Pressurized cockpits failed. Pilots bailed out at altitudes where the air is too thin to sustain consciousness, and nobody knew with any precision what happened to a human body under those conditions, how fast it failed, whether it could recover, whether a man falling from 12,000 meters could be saved. There was a way to find out that did not involve killing anyone. You build the chamber, you put a volunteer inside, you take him to the edge of his tolerance, and you stop. That is not what happened. In May 1941, a young Luftwaffe physician named Sigmund Rascher wrote to Heinrich Himmler. Rascher was 32. He was ambitious and not especially distinguished, and he had a connection. His wife had personal access to Himmler. In his letter, he complained that research was being held back because it could not be taken far enough, and he suggested a solution: prisoners. Himmler agreed. A mobile low-pressure chamber supplied by the Luftwaffe was moved to the Dachau concentration camp, roughly 16 kilometers northwest of Munich. It was a steel cylinder mounted on a trailer with a window. What happened inside it is documented in unusual detail for a reason that will matter later. Rascher wrote to Himmler about it repeatedly, and Rascher took photographs. Prisoners were placed in the chamber. The pressure was lowered to simulate altitudes reported as high as 15,000 meters, around 68,000 feet, far above anything a human being can survive unprotected. Sometimes the descent was simulated as a slow climb. Sometimes it was instantaneous to reproduce an explosive decompression. The observers watched through the window and wrote down what they saw. When to the minute the subject stopped responding. When the convulsions began. When breathing stopped. In an interim report to Himmler dated the 5th of April 1942, Rascher noted that in continuous experiments above a certain altitude, breathing ceased after roughly half an hour, and that in 2 cases, the heart's electrical activity continued to be traced for around 20 minutes afterward. Read that sentence again and notice what it actually tells you. It tells you that someone was still connected to an electrocardiograph. It tells you that the experiment did not stop at death. It continued through it, because the data continued past it. Around 200 people are believed to have been used. Post-war testimony indicates that 70 to 80 died in the chamber itself. Others, according to that testimony, were killed afterward. There is one further claim that circulates widely, and it needs to be handled carefully, because this film will not tell you anything it cannot support. A former prisoner named Anton Pakoleg, who worked in the administrative office attached to Rascher's unit, testified in May 1945 that Rascher performed dissections on victims who were not yet dead in order to observe the effects of decompression on the brain directly. That testimony exists. It was taken by American investigators.
It is part of the record. It is also uncorroborated by physical evidence, and historians treat it as testimony rather than as established fact. Some accounts repeat it as certainty. This one will not. What is beyond dispute is narrower and somehow worse. Around 200 people who could not refuse were placed in a machine designed to take them past the limit of human survival. And the men operating it recorded the results in a scientific format, in complete sentences, with correct terminology, and sent them to Berlin. But the chamber was only the beginning of what happened at Dachau, because the Luftwaffe had a second problem, and it was killing far more of their men than altitude ever did.
Cold water. That was the real killer. German air crews shot down over the North Sea and the Baltic were dying not from the crash and not from the enemy, but from immersion. A man in the water at 4 degrees Celsius has less than an hour. Rescue crews were pulling airmen out alive and watching them die anyway, sometimes after they had been brought aboard, sometimes after they had been warmed. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew the correct way to re-warm a severely hypothermic body. It is genuinely an important medical question. It still is. From roughly August 1942, Rascher was joined at Dachau by Professor Ernst Holzlener of the University of Kiel and a Luftwaffe physician named Erich Fink. A tank was filled with water and ice. Prisoners were placed into it. Most accounts describe them being dressed in flight uniforms to reproduce the conditions of a downed airman. Thermometers were used to monitor internal body temperature continuously. The men in the room recorded the readings as the temperature fell, the shivering, the loss of coordination, the point at which speech stopped, the point at which consciousness stopped. Immersion in some cases lasted well over an hour. Then came the second half of the experiment, and this is the part that most people never hear about, because it is not dramatic, it is procedural. They tried to bring the men back. Hot baths of varying temperatures, warm blankets and sleeping bags, ultraviolet lamps, internal irrigation with warm fluids, slow rewarming versus rapid rewarming, tested against each other, group against group. And in one series, ordered specifically by Himmler, who had his own theories, unconscious men were placed between the bodies of women prisoners brought from Ravensbrück to see whether body heat would revive them. That detail is documented in the correspondence. It is also the clearest evidence that this had stopped being research in any recognizable sense, because there was no scientific hypothesis. There was a powerful man's intuition and a supply of people who could be used to test it. Estimates of the number of subjects in the Dachau hypothermia experiments generally fall between about 280 and 300, with perhaps 80 to 90 deaths. The precise figures are not recoverable. Records were destroyed. A comprehensive report on the freezing experiments, signed by Holzlener, Rascher, and Fink, was dated the 21st of October, 1942. It was prepared for a presentation at a medical conference on hypothermia from military personnel, which means a room full of doctors sat and listened to it. Now hold on to a question, because it will come back at the end of this film, and it has never been fully settled. After the war, this data survived. Some of it entered the scientific literature, and for decades, researchers working on cold water survival, a field that saves lives, have had to decide whether to cite it. In 1990, the physician Robert Berger published a detailed analysis of the Dachau hypothermia study in the New England Journal of Medicine. He examined the report the way you would examine any paper submitted for publication: methods, controls, internal consistency, plausibility of the reported measurements. His conclusion was that the study was not merely unethical, it was unreliable. The record-keeping was inconsistent, the experimental design was incoherent, and there were indications that some results had been fabricated outright. The men in that room had abandoned every principle of medicine in order to obtain data, and the data was not even good. That pattern, atrocity producing worthless science, repeats, but not always, and the next chapter
is where it gets genuinely difficult.
Here is the scenario the German military was trying to solve. An aircrew ditches in the ocean. They get into a life raft. They have emergency rations and a limited supply of fresh water. Around them, in every direction, is an infinite quantity of water they cannot drink. Seawater is roughly 3.5% salt. Drinking it accelerates dehydration because the body must spend more water excreting the salt than it gains from the liquid. Everyone knew this in 1944. The question was whether it could be engineered around. Two competing solutions were on the table. One was a chemical additive called berkettit, which masked the taste of salt without removing it, meaning it made undrinkable water drinkable in the sense that a person would swallow it, not in the sense that it would keep them alive. The other, developed by IG Farben, actually removed the salt, but required more scarce materials to manufacture. There was an argument inside the German bureaucracy about which to adopt. They decided to settle it with an experiment. From roughly July to September 1944, at Dachau, a study was carried out under the direction of the Viennese physician Wilhelm Begelbach, working under the internist Hans Eppinger. The subjects were Romani prisoners, Sinti and Roma, brought from Auschwitz and from within Dachau itself. The number is genuinely disputed. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and other institutions cite roughly 90. Detailed victim-by-victim biographical research undertaken by the German Society for Internal Medicine, working from surviving documentation, identifies 44 individuals with certainty, and notes that some prisoners originally selected were withdrawn beforehand because they were already too ill. Both figures are in the literature. Neither can currently be proven exclusive of the other. Where a documentary tells you a number to the decimal point about something like this, be suspicious. The design was straightforward. The men were divided into groups. One group received ordinary drinking water. One received nothing at all. One received seawater with berkettit. One received seawater processed by the IG Farben method. They were deprived of food. They were kept that way for days. Karl Hollenreiner was one of them. He was a Sinto, born in Fürth in March 1914. He had been living in Munich. He was arrested on the 29th of May 1944 and deported to the Romani section of Auschwitz-Birkenau and from there to Dachau. He was in his early 30s. He survived. And in June 1947, in a courtroom in Nuremberg, he took the witness stand. His testimony did something specific and important. It dismantled the defense. The physicians on trial had argued that the participants had volunteered and that they had been given better rations in exchange. Hollenreiner's account, together with the surviving documents, showed that neither was true. He described the thirst. He described being unable to keep anything down. He described losing weight and developing fever. He described prisoners so desperate for water that they drank from anything they could find. Then the prosecutor asked him to identify the doctor. Hollenreiner looked at the doc, found the man, and went over the rail. He struck Wilhelm Begelbach in the face. According to a Viennese newspaper report from the day, he shouted that this man had destroyed his life. The presiding judge sentenced him to 90 days for contempt of court in the middle of the session. He was released on probation shortly afterward. Begelbach was sentenced to 15 years. It was later reduced to 10. His defense counsel never released the list of the victims' names to the court, and Begelbach had altered the experimental records before handing them over, removing names, which made it significantly harder for prosecutors to find surviving witnesses. Think about what that means. A doctor's final act in this story was not the experiment. It was editing the file so the people in it could not be found.
There is a phrase in medical research that sounds harmless: challenge study. It means you give a healthy person a disease on purpose so that you can test whether something protects them from it. Done ethically, with volunteers who understand the risk, with a treatable illness, with the power to withdraw at any moment, it is legitimate, and it has saved enormous numbers of lives. Remove the consent, and it becomes something for which we do not have a medical word. At Dachau, from February 1942 until the final days of the war, a retired professor named Klaus Schilling ran a malaria program. Schilling was 71 when he began. He was not a Nazi Party member. He had been a genuinely eminent tropical medicine researcher at the Robert Koch Institute, with a career going back to the 1990s. He had spent decades chasing one goal: a vaccine against malaria. Himmler gave him Dachau. Prisoners were infected, either through the bites of infected mosquitoes held against the skin in small gauze cages or by direct injection. Then they were treated with various experimental and existing anti-malarial compounds at a range of doses, some of them toxic. Around 1,100 people were infected. The camp maintained a card index recording each case and the course of the illness, a document that survives today in the Arlsen archives. First, they used prisoners from the punishment detachment, then Polish Catholic clergy, then, increasingly, Soviet and Italian prisoners. Estimates of the deaths attributable to these experiments generally run to 300 or 400, though causation is genuinely difficult to establish. A starved prisoner, infected with malaria and then dosed with an experimental drug who dies of tuberculosis, has been killed by all three at once. Schilling was tried after the war and hanged in 1946. During his defense, he asked to be allowed to finish his research first. He said it would be a terrible loss if the work could not be completed. He appears to have meant it sincerely. That is the disturbing part. Elsewhere, the same logic was applied to other diseases. At Buchenwald, in an isolated block, prisoners were infected with typhus to test vaccines. At Notzweiler and Sachsenhausen, prisoners were exposed to mustard gas and phosgene so that antidotes could be evaluated. At Neuengamme, prisoners were infected with tuberculosis. And at Ravensbrück, the concentration camp for women north of Berlin, the injuries were not caught, they were manufactured. In the summer of 1942, on Himmler's order, a series of experiments began under the direction of Karl Gebhardt, a distinguished orthopedic surgeon who was Himmler's personal physician, assisted by Fritz Fischer and by the camp's own doctor, Herta Oberhausen. The military question was real. German soldiers were dying of wound infections on the Eastern Front, and there was a fierce professional dispute about whether to treat them surgically or with the new sulfonamide drugs. 74 young Polish women were selected, most from a transport from Lublin, most of them arrested for work with the Polish underground, most of them very young. Incisions were made in their legs. Bacteria were introduced into the wounds, the organisms that cause gangrene, tetanus, staphylococcal and streptococcal infection. To reproduce the conditions of a battlefield injury, the wounds were packed with foreign material, dirt, wood shavings, ground glass. Circulation was interrupted by tying off the vessels at either end. Then the wounds were closed, and the infection was allowed to establish itself, and the drugs were tested against it.
The women called themselves króliki, rabbits. Of those 74, 5 died as a direct result. 6, who were still carrying unhealed wounds, were executed inside the camp. 63 survived, most of them permanently disabled. And they did something extraordinary. They understood while it was happening that they were evidence. They organized, they protested collectively and encouraged other prisoners to refuse. They smuggled messages out written in urine, invisible until heated. And using a camera obtained inside the camp, they photographed their own injuries in secret behind the barracks. Film that was hidden, capped, and developed after liberation. Those photographs were entered into evidence at Nuremberg.
4 of the women, Jadwiga Dzido, Maria Kusmierczuk, Władysława Karolewska, and Maria Bröll-Plater, traveled to Germany and testified in person. One of them stood in the courtroom and showed the court her leg. The victims of these experiments are almost always described as passive. They were not. Some of them spent 3 years building the case that would convict the people who did it to them. Everything described so far had a military rationale. A bad one, a criminal one, a scientifically incompetent one, but a rationale you could state in a sentence. We are trying to keep our own soldiers alive. At Auschwitz, that pretense largely disappears. To understand why, you have to understand what Auschwitz was structurally to a research scientist. Roughly 1.3 million people were sent there. They came from every part of occupied Europe, every nationality, every age, entire families arriving together on the same train. They were catalogued on arrival, they could not leave, they had no legal existence, and a physician working there had absolute authority over all of them. For a certain kind of researcher, that was not a horror, it was an opportunity. If you needed 100 subjects with a specific rare characteristic, a particular eye condition, a particular skeletal anomaly, a particular family relationship, there was nowhere else on earth you could find them assembled in one place, already registered, already indexed, with no possibility of refusal. One of Josef Mengele's own colleagues later recalled him saying that it would be a crime to not make use of the opportunities Auschwitz presented. Mengele was one of around 50 physicians who served there. He was not the senior doctor. He was not in command of the others. More than a dozen SS medical personnel conducted experiments at Auschwitz, including Eduard Wirtz, the head camp physician, the gynecologist Karl Klauberg, Horst Schumann, who had run gassing operations in the euthanasia program, the anatomy professor Johann Paul Kramer, and Helmut Vetter, who ran drug trials at Dachau, Auschwitz, and Gusen for a subsidiary of the chemical conglomerate IG Farben. That last name deserves a pause, because it means the camps were not sealed off from the ordinary economy of German science. Pharmaceutical compounds were tested on prisoners. Body parts and tissue samples were shipped out to universities and research institutes in Germany, where they were received, catalogued, studied, and in some cases used in publications and teaching collections that remained in circulation for decades after the war. The camp was not the edge of the system, it was a supplier to it. The most extreme example of that supply chain is the case of August Hirt, an anatomist at the Reich University of Strasbourg. Hirt wanted a collection of skeletons that he believed would demonstrate the biological inferiority of Jews. There was no such collection in existence, so 86 people were selected at Auschwitz according to his specifications, transported to the Natzweiler camp, and murdered there. Their bodies were sent to Strasbourg. When Allied forces reached the Anatomy Institute in 1944, they found remains that had not been fully disposed of. The victims were, for decades, nameless. Painstaking archival work has since identified most of them. They had names, addresses, occupations, and families. They were selected because their measurements matched a hypothesis. Nothing about that was medicine. It was murder with a catalog number. But the largest experimental program at Auschwitz was not about anatomy or disease at all. It was about reproduction, and it was intended to be used on millions of people. Consider a bureaucratic problem, stated coldly in the way the men who wrote it down stated it. The regime intended to eliminate entire populations. Mass murder was expensive, logistically enormous, and difficult to conceal. There was an alternative under discussion: sterilization. Allow a population to work and simply ensure that it does not continue. But existing surgical sterilization required an operating theater, an anesthesiast, a surgeon, recovery time. It could not be scaled. So a conference was convened, attended by Himmler, by Karl Gebhardt, and by Richard Glucks, the inspector of concentration camps, and it set a specification. Find a method that can sterilize an unlimited number of people in the shortest possible time, in the simplest possible way. Two men were given the problem, and they took two different approaches. The first was Karl Klauberg. He was a respected gynecologist and authority on the treatment of infertility, a specialist, in other words, in helping people conceive. He had spent his career on the opposite problem, and that expertise was exactly why he was chosen. Klauberg began working in a barracks in the women's camp at Birkenau at the end of 1942. In April 1943, the camp commandant Rudolf Hess assigned him Block 10 in the main camp, a two-story brick building. Between roughly 100 and 400 Jewish women from across occupied Europe were held in the upper rooms. The method was a chemical injected into the uterus, presented to the women as a routine gynecological examination. The substance caused severe inflammation. Over the following weeks, the fallopian tubes would fuse and close. It also caused agonizing pain, high fever, peritonitis, hemorrhage, and sepsis. Women died. Others were killed afterward so that autopsies could be performed to assess whether the procedure had worked. Klauberg wrote to Himmler about his progress with the pride of a man reporting a breakthrough. He estimated, once perfected, a single experienced physician with an adequately equipped room and around 10 assistants could process something in the order of 1,000 women per day. That is the sentence. That is what the laboratory was for. The second man was Horst Schumann. He had previously directed 2 euthanasia killing centers at Grafeneck and Sonnenstein, and had personally overseen the gassing of people with disabilities. At Auschwitz, he was given a station in the women's camp equipped with 2 X-ray machines and a lead-shielded control cabin from which he could operate them. His approach was radiation. Young men and women, many between 18 and 20, were made to stand between the machines while their reproductive organs were irradiated as Schumann searched for the minimum dose that would produce permanent sterility. The immediate results were severe radiation burns to the abdomen, groin, and buttocks, which developed into deep, slow-healing ulceration. Some victims died. Most of the survivors were later selected for the gas chambers because burns of that kind made them unfit for labor. And to determine whether the radiation had actually worked, some victims were subjected to surgical removal of the irradiated organs so the tissue could be examined. Now step back and see the shape of the whole thing. A woman is taken into a clean room. There is a gynecological chair. There is a physician of international reputation. There are instruments and case notes and a numbered file. She is told this is an examination. Every element of a medical encounter is present except the only one that makes it medicine, that it is being done for her. Instead, it is being done to determine on her body how efficiently a government could erase a people. This is why the sterilization program sits at the center of this story rather than at its edge. The military experiments were crimes committed inside a war. This was something else. The medical profession being used as an instrument of extermination policy at scale with a projected daily throughput. Neither man was ever meaningfully punished. Klauberg was captured by Soviet forces, imprisoned and repatriated to West Germany in 1955, where he publicly boasted about the method he had perfected. Only after protest from survivor organizations was he arrested. He died in custody in 1957, before he could be brought to trial. Schumann fled Germany after the war and worked as a physician in Africa for years. He was eventually extradited and brought to trial in Frankfurt in 1970. The proceedings were suspended on grounds of his health. He lived out his days and died in his bed.
Josef Mengele has become a character. He appears in films and novels as a kind of gothic villain, the mad scientist, the sadist with a scalpel, a man performing meaningless cruelties in a basement. Almost every part of that portrait is wrong, and the correction is far more frightening than the myth. Mengele was a serious, credentialed scientist. He held a doctorate in physical anthropology from the University of Munich in 1935, and a second doctorate in medicine completed in 1938. He worked at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt as assistant to Ottmar von Rascher, one of the most respected geneticists in Germany and an internationally recognized authority on the study of twins. He was decorated for frontline service on the Eastern Front, receiving the Iron Cross first and second class. He was, by the standards of his profession and his country, a rising man. He was assigned to Auschwitz on the 30th of May 1943. There is evidence he may have asked for the posting. And here is the crucial point. When Mengele began collecting twins, he was not inventing a bizarre personal obsession. He was pursuing the central research question of his entire field. Twin studies are a legitimate and powerful method. Identical twins share a genome. If you can compare them, you can begin to separate what is inherited from what is environmental. That method is still used today. Rascher had built his career on it. Before the war, researchers doing this work had to recruit twins, obtain their consent or their parents' consent, and persuade them to participate, which meant twin studies were always small. At Auschwitz, that constraint vanished. Mengele stood on the arrival ramp and had twins pulled out of the crowd as families were being separated. Parents sometimes pushed their children forward, believing, correctly in the short term, that being chosen might mean survival. The children selected were housed separately. They received better food. They were not worked. Mengele was, by many survivor accounts, friendly towards them. He brought sweets. Some of the youngest children called him uncle. Then came the examinations. Every measurable feature of their bodies was recorded and compared, twin against twin, in enormous detail. Blood was drawn repeatedly and in large volumes from the fingers, then from larger vessels, sometimes several times from the same child. A prisoner nurse who cared for the children, Elżbieta Piłsudska-Warszawska, described the blood collections afterwards. The children screaming, covering themselves, trying to avoid being touched, and the staff using force. Substances were placed in their eyes as part of a study of eye color being conducted with a colleague at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. The recorded outcomes ranged from irritation and swelling to blindness, and in some cases, death. Surgical procedures were performed. Injections were given whose contents the children could not know. Mengele Lorenzi, who was 10 years old at Auschwitz and carried the number A12090, described injections that made his sister so ill that her neck swelled with infection and an operation performed on her without anesthetic. Moshe Ofer, in an account given in 1985, described Mengele arriving like a kindly uncle with chocolate, telling him and his twin brother Tibi to not be afraid, that nothing would happen to them. He described chemical injections, surgery on Tibi's spine, pins inserted into their heads, the scars from which he still carried. And then one day, Tibi was taken away for several days and came back with his head bandaged. He died in my arms, Ofer said. And when a pair of twins died or was killed, both bodies were autopsied together because the scientific value lay in the comparison. Organs were removed and shipped to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, where they were received by an institution with a letterhead and a budget. Now, how many children?
you will see the figure of 1,500 pairs, 3,000 children, with fewer than 100 survivors quoted almost everywhere. The honest answer is that nobody knows. The camp's own records were largely destroyed. The commonly repeated numbers derive from post-war estimates rather than from documents. The historian Paul Weindling, who has led the largest systematic effort to identify individual victims of Nazi research from surviving records, has been able to document 582 twins collected by Mengele. The United States Holocaust Museum states only that he collected hundreds of pairs. The true figure is probably higher than 582 and lower than the popular number. It cannot currently be established. There is also a story that circulates constantly. Mengele surgically joined two Romani twins together. It comes from testimony given under oath by a former prisoner, Vera Alexander, at the Eichmann trial in 1961. It is a real piece of testimony from a real witness. It has never been corroborated by documentary evidence, and historians who have examined Mengele's work closely treat it with caution. This film includes it only to be clear what it is: a survivor's sworn recollection, unverified. Because the temptation, always, is to reach for the most extreme version of the story. And the extreme version is a distraction, because it lets you believe this was done by a monster, which means it could not be done by a colleague, a supervisor, or an institution with a letterhead. Mengele was not an aberration within German science. He was operating, as the Holocaust Museum puts it directly, within its norms. He escaped. He worked as a farmhand in Bavaria for 4 years, then reached Argentina in 1949 under a false name. He obtained citizenship. He moved to Paraguay, then Brazil. He drowned after a stroke while swimming near Bertioga in February 1979, aged 67, buried under another man's name. His body was exhumed in 1985 and identified. DNA testing confirmed it in 1992. 34 years. He was never arrested, never charged, never questioned. Which raises the question this film has been circling from the beginning.
Almost nobody in this story was ordered to do it. That is the single most uncomfortable fact in the entire history, and it is the reason the usual explanation collapses. The usual explanation is coercion. They were under a totalitarian regime. They were following orders. Refusal meant death. It is the defense that was mounted at Nuremberg, and it did not survive contact with the evidence. Because the evidence shows initiative. Sigmund Rascher was not assigned to the high-altitude experiments. He wrote to Himmler and proposed them, arguing that his research was being obstructed by the lack of suitable subjects. Kurt Heissmeyer at Neuengamme was not instructed to infect prisoners with tuberculosis. He wanted a professorship, and to obtain one, he needed original research. His hypothesis that injecting live tuberculous bacilli could function as a vaccine was already known to be wrong. He pursued it anyway. Karl Clauberg lobbied for his assignment and reported his progress with evident pride. Josef Mengele appears to have requested Auschwitz. And research proposals went to the Reich Research Council and the German Research Foundation for approval and funding, exactly as ordinary research does. Committees read them, administrators signed them, money was allocated. So the question is not what forced them. The question is, what did they want? And the answer is depressingly ordinary. They wanted publications. They wanted priority over rivals working on the same problem. They wanted professorships, directorships, institutes with their names attached.
They wanted to solve a problem before someone else solved it. Ambition is not a Nazi invention. Every scientist has it. It is, in normal circumstances, useful. What Nazi Germany supplied was not the ambition. It was the removal of the only thing standing between ambition and a human body, the requirement to ask. And once the asking was gone, an entire scale of research opened up that had never been available to anyone. You could run the study with 100 subjects instead of 6. You could include a control group that received nothing. You could take the measurement at the endpoint because you controlled when the endpoint occurred. For a certain kind of mind, that is not a moral catastrophe. It is a methodological improvement. That is the sentence to sit with. Not cruelty, not sadism, efficiency. Some of them were sadists. Rascher, by most accounts, was. But most were not. And if you build your understanding of this history around sadism, you will learn nothing that protects anyone. The men in these rooms did not, for the most part, feel that they were committing murder. They felt they were working.
Look at how the language works. A prisoner is not a prisoner in the documentation. He is a subject. A death is an exodus. A group of people condemned to a fatal procedure is a series. Killing someone in order to examine their organs is facilitating post-mortem examination. None of these terms are lies, exactly. Every one of them is a standard, correct piece of scientific vocabulary. That is precisely what makes them effective. Technical language does something to the person using it. It converts a moral event into a procedural one. You are no longer deciding whether to kill a 12-year-old girl. You are determining whether the tissue sample should be obtained fresh. Around that language, the system built layers, and each layer allowed everyone in it to feel like a small part of something. Himmler authorized. The Reich Research Council funded. The camp administration supplied the bodies. The Luftwaffe supplied the equipment. A university professor designed the protocol. A junior physician performed the procedure. A prisoner clerk maintained the card index. A courier carried the organs to Berlin, where a laboratory technician logged them in. Nobody in that chain did the whole thing. Every person in it could point at the person before them and the person after them. And this is where the fascination with individual monsters becomes actively dangerous. If Mengele is the story, then the story ends in 1979 in the water off Bertioga. But Mengele could not have obtained a single subject without a camp administration, could not have shipped a single specimen without a functioning postal system, and had nowhere to send the specimens without a prestigious institute in Berlin willing to receive them. His mentor, Ottmar von Verschuer, received material from Auschwitz. Verschuer was never convicted of anything. In 1951, he became professor of human genetics at the University of Münster and one of the most influential figures in post-war West German genetics. He supervised students. He shaped a discipline. The Holocaust Museum states it plainly. After the war, only a few of the biomedical experts who helped build and legitimize Nazi racial policy were ever indicted or professionally disciplined. Most of them simply carried on. That is not a failure of the trials, which will come shortly. It is the answer to the question this film opened with. A law requiring consent existed the entire time. It failed to protect anyone, because a law only functions when the people it constrains regard those it protects as belonging to the same category of being as themselves.
The regulation was never repealed. It was simply understood not to apply.
A separate chapter about a separate country and a separate program. Unit 731 had no organizational connection to Nazi Germany. It is included here because the same question, what happens when doctors are given people who cannot refuse, was answered independently on the other side of the world at almost exactly the same time. In occupied Manchuria, outside the city of Harbin, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a facility in the Pingfang district under a deliberately dull name, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. It was a biological weapons program led by an army physician and microbiologist named Shiro Ishii, and it grew from earlier work in the early 1930s into a large complex from around 1936 with its own rail connection and its own prison. Prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, along with Russians, Koreans, and others, were subjected to deliberate infection with plague, anthrax, cholera, and other pathogens, to frostbite experimentation, and to surgical procedures without anesthesia. Inside the facility, the prisoners were referred to in the records as maruta, logs. The death toll cannot be established. Staff destroyed records and killed remaining prisoners as Soviet forces advanced in August 1945. Estimates in the scholarly literature vary enormously depending on whether field operations against civilian populations are included, ranging from several thousand at the facility itself to figures in the hundreds of thousands overall. Anyone who gives you a confident single number is telling you something the evidence does not support. What is documented in declassified American records is the ending. Ishii and senior members of the unit were granted immunity from prosecution by United States authorities in exchange for their research data. The reasoning was recorded at the time. The material was considered valuable. It could not have been obtained under American ethical constraints, and the alternative was that the Soviet Union would get it. The Nuremberg doctors' trial produced a code of ethics. The Japanese program produced a transaction. Two different Allied responses to the same crime in the same decade, one of which we teach in every medical school, and one of which was classified for 40 years. The men who ran these programs knew exactly what they had done, and you can prove it by what they did at the end. They began destroying it. Records were burned, card indexes disappeared, buildings were emptied, and in several documented cases, the surviving subjects of experiments were killed, not out of rage and not as part of the general slaughter of the final months, but for a specific and cold reason. They were witnesses. The clearest case is also the worst. In November 1944, 20 Jewish children, 10 boys and 10 girls, aged between 5 and 12, were selected at Auschwitz and sent to the Neuengamme camp near Hamburg at the request of an SS physician named Kurt Heismeyer. Heismeyer injected them with live tuberculosis bacilli. He then surgically removed lymph nodes from under their arms and sent the tissue to a colleague at another hospital for analysis. The children were photographed afterward, each holding up an arm to display the incision. 2 French doctors and 2 Dutch nurses, all of them prisoners, were assigned to care for them. One of the Frenchmen, Professor Gabriel Florence, tried to boil the bacterial suspension before it was injected, hoping to kill the bacteria and save the children. It did not work. On the night of the 20th of April, 1945, with British troops approaching Hamburg, the children were taken from Neuengamme to the basement of a former school building on Bullenhusser Damm and murdered there, along with their 4 caregivers and a number of Soviet prisoners. One of the children was Sergio De Simone. He was born in Naples on the 29th of November, 1937. He was 7 years old. He was killed because he had a scar, and the scar was evidence. But not everything was destroyed, and this is why we know any of it.
Sigmund Rascher's correspondence with Himmler survived because it was filed in Himmler's own papers, and Rascher had photographed his own experiments. The clandestine photographs taken by the women at Ravensbrück survived, hidden by prisoners developed after liberation. The Dachau malaria card index survived. Reports, requisitions, funding applications, and shipping records survived because a bureaucracy that generates paper in 5 copies cannot burn all 5. Soviet forces reached Auschwitz on the 27th of January, 1945. Block 10 was still standing. So was the gynecological chair. American forces reached Dachau on the 29th of April, 1945. Among the prisoners they found was a Czech physician, Franz Blaha, who had been imprisoned there since 1941 and had been forced to work in the camp's pathology department, performing autopsies. He had, in effect, been made to catalog the results. After liberation, he gave a sworn affidavit describing what he had seen: the low-pressure chamber, the freezing tank, the malaria program. And it became one of the foundational documents of the prosecution. The man who ran the chamber and the tank was not there. Sigmund Rascher had been arrested by the SS in 1944 and executed at Dachau on Himmler's orders in April 1945, days before the Americans arrived. Not for the experiments. He and his wife had been exposed for faking the births of children they had actually acquired elsewhere, a fraud that had embarrassed Himmler personally. He was killed for lying about babies. The 200 people in the chamber were never part of the charge.
On the 9th of December, 1946, in Nuremberg, an American military tribunal opened proceedings in a case officially titled United States of America versus Karl Brandt and others. 23 defendants, 20 of them physicians, the rest administrators. It was the first of 12 subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, and it is remembered simply as the doctor's trial. The chief of counsel was Brigadier General Telford Taylor. His opening statement laid out the charge in language that has never been improved upon. The defendants were accused of murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. He told the tribunal that the victims numbered in the hundreds of thousands, that only a handful were still alive, and that most of them were nameless dead, because to the men who killed them, they had never been individuals at all. They had arrived, he said, in bulk. The trial ran for roughly 140 days. 85 witnesses gave evidence. Nearly 1,500 documents were entered. The prosecution's method was, in a sense, simple. It used the defendants' own paperwork against them. The reports they had written, the letters they had sent, the photographs they had taken. And alongside the documents, the survivors, the Polish women from Ravensbrück and Karl Hollandreiner from the seawater experiments, stood in the room and described what had been done. The defense argued 3 things: that the experiments were militarily necessary in wartime, that the subjects had volunteered, and, most consequentially, that no international law existed that distinguished a legal human experiment from an illegal one, and that comparable research had been conducted before the war by German scientists in Germany and in the Allied countries alike. That third argument was the dangerous one, because it was not entirely baseless. It was also, in a specific sense, self-defeating. The defense itself raised Germany's own 1931 guidelines, asking to be measured against them. They were asking the court to apply a standard they had comprehensively violated. The judgment was read on the 19th and 20th of August, 1947. 16 of the defendants were convicted. 7 were acquitted. 7 were sentenced to death: Karl Brandt, Karl Gebhardt, Rudolf Brandt, Joachim Rogowski, Wolfram Sievers, Victor Brack, and Waldemar Hoven. They were hanged at Landsberg prison on the 2nd of June, 1948. The others received prison terms, and this is where the story of justice becomes considerably less satisfying.
Fritz Fischer, who would cut into the legs of the women at Ravensbrück, received a life imprisonment. He was released within about 7 years and went on to a career in the pharmaceutical industry. Herta Oberhusser, the only woman among the defendants and the only physician who had been present at Ravensbrück day after day, received 20 years. She was released in 1952 after roughly 5 and opened a family medical practice in northern Germany. She was treating patients until a survivor recognized her and her license was revoked. Wilhelm Bigelbuck's 15 years became 10. 23 people stood trial. Set that against the most careful count we have of the victims. The historian Paul Weindling and his colleagues, working from surviving records across dozens of institutions, have documented a minimum of 15,754 individual victims of Nazi human experimentation and coerced research, with a further 12,000 cases pending verification, and at least 4,120 deaths directly attributable to medical research. 23 defendants. 15,000 documented victims, and that is the floor, not the estimate. The arithmetic does not balance, and it never will.
But the trial produced something the executions did not. During the proceedings, 2 American physicians working with the prosecution, Andrew Ivy and Leo Alexander, recognized how much damage the defense's third argument could do. If there was genuinely no written standard, then convicting these men risked looking like victor's justice applied retroactively. On the 17th of April, 1947, Alexander submitted a memorandum to the United States Council for War Crimes, setting out 6 principles that defined a legitimate human experiment. When the judgment was delivered 4 months later, the tribunal included a section titled Permissible Medical Experiments. It adopted almost all of Alexander's points and expanded them from 6 to 10. Those 10 points became known as the Nuremberg Code. The first of them is the one that matters most, and it is written without qualification. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The code goes further than that single sentence. It requires that consent be given by someone with the legal capacity and the actual freedom to refuse without force, fraud, deceit, duress, or coercion of any kind. It requires that the person be told in advance the nature and purpose and duration of the experiment, the method, the hazards, and the effects it may have on their health. It requires that the research have a genuine scientific justification and be designed on the basis of prior work, not conducted at random. It requires that unnecessary suffering be avoided, that the risk never exceed the humanitarian importance of the question, and that no experiment be conducted at all where there is prior reason to believe death or disabling injury will result. And it contains 2 provisions that read like a direct answer to everything in this film. The subject must be free to end the experiment at any moment, and the scientist in charge must be prepared to stop it himself at any stage if continuing is likely to cause injury or death. Now, the honest part. The Nuremberg Code did not create modern medical ethics single-handedly. And it is not true that consent was an unknown concept before 1947. Germany's own 1931 guidelines, the ones this film opened with, already contained most of these principles, and a Prussian directive of 100 had contained some of them. The code's legal force was never firmly established. It was a passage in a judgment, not a treaty. For years, it was widely regarded by physicians in the United States and elsewhere as a document about Nazis, a code for barbarians, not for respectable research. The proof of that is uncomfortable. The Tuskegee syphilis study, in which hundreds of Black American men were denied treatment for decades without being told what was being done to them, continued until 1972, 25 years after Nuremberg, in the country that wrote the code. What the code did accomplish was slower and more durable. It became the reference point. It shaped the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964 and national research regulations and the ethics committees that now review every study involving human beings. Every consent form you have ever signed is descended from that section of that judgment. It is worth knowing what it cost.
Return one last time to the room. Nothing in it looks wrong. The instruments have been sterilized, the temperature is controlled, the chart is filled in correctly in a trained hand using the standard abbreviations. The man holding the syringe spent a decade of his life learning to hold it properly, and he is not angry, and he is not enjoying this. He is concentrating. Every external marker of medicine is present. One thing is missing, and it is not a piece of equipment. It is the moment, the entirely invisible moment in which a physician looks at the person in front of him and recognizes a self, someone with a history and a preference and the standing to say no. Take that away and nothing else changes. The room still looks like a hospital. The paperwork is still correct. The terminology is still accurate. That is the finding this history offers, and it is not a comfortable one, because it does not point at a category of person we can identify and exclude. The men in these rooms were not identifiable in advance. They were qualified, many were respected, some were brilliant. They had the same training as their colleagues in London and Boston and Paris, and read the same journals and wanted the same things: to solve the problem, to publish first, to matter. What separated them was not intelligence, and it was not sadism. It was a single permission granted by an ideology and enforced by a state, that a certain category of human being did not have to be asked. Everything else followed from that in an orderly way with correct paperwork for 3.5 years. 15,754 people are documented. There were more. Most of them will never be named because the names were in the files and the files were burned. The instruments were medical. The rooms were clinical. The men holding the instruments were doctors. Medicine is not defined by any of those things. It is defined by a single question asked out loud of a person who is free to answer it. Where that question is not asked, everything that remains, the sterile field, the careful notes, the calm and educated voice explaining what will happen next, is not medicine. It is only the shape of it,